Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about building ChatGPT apps and MCP apps, specifically around principles for designing this new kind of interface. And so, as we know, now that we've got apps inside AI clients, it's fundamentally different from things that we've had before, right? Building mobile apps, building web apps. It's a different way to think about these kind of applications. And so what I'm going to do today is just talk about our experience doing this. We build these kind of apps for enterprises, and I'm just going to share some stories. I'm also going to share a lot of data. So we have a huge amount of data on the different MCP app stores as well, and so we're seeing some very interesting things. So I'm going to share that as well. And really, I think by the end of the talk, I would love it if you've got basically some just practical things that you can take away to better design ChatGPT apps and MCP apps. And maybe a first thing I want to do is just gauge the room a little bit. So how many people have actually built a ChatGPT app before? OK, maybe like a third to a half, so that's cool. I'll go through a little bit about how they work in terms of like an architecture and stuff like that, and then we'll get to the principles and the data and all of that kind of stuff. So a little bit about me, us. I'm Elliot Garreffa, co-founder of Ghost Team. We build and distribute ChatGPT apps and MCP apps. So on the Ghost Team side, we're a development studio. We consult, we develop, we educate. But then we have a platform called appdiscoverability.com where we help MCP apps actually get distributed, actually get users. Once you've built them, how do you get them discovered? We work with different enterprise clients, mainly Statista, Manpower, Mitchells and Butlers, companies like this. And as part of the app discoverability platform, we track the core app stores. So we track ChatGPT, we track Claude, we basically have data refreshes every single day on all the applications. And so we're going to be using a lot of this data actually in the presentation today because we're seeing a ton of interesting things. And I think the first thing mainly to just prime this with is that we're seeing a very fundamental shift from what was the fragmented web to now the intent-based web. And so previously, you had to go to the internet, you had to search something, you had to go and find the tool that you were looking for, and then navigate their UI to try and achieve the thing you wanted to achieve. Now, with the intent-based web, you're moving to an area where you just prompt, and then you will actually have the tool come to you. Now, it's a fundamentally different way of actually discovering products. It's a fundamentally different way of using products, and it's core to the way that we actually need to think about designing these kind of applications. And this is some of the data in terms of we've been tracking it since the beginning of the App Store, specifically for ChatGPT. And so you can see that there was a period basically at the beginning before we got to about sort of early February, beginning of February, where it was a bit flat. They weren't accepting new applications yet. And then they really started to accept a large number of applications. And that's been picking up and up. Then actually recently, I don't know how closely you follow this, but they've been talking about their kind of super app that they're bringing together. I think it was a bit of consolidation and discussion. And actually, since that point, we've had a really big pickup of apps. So the last 10 days, there's been 96 apps that have gone live. And these are some of the biggest brands in the world. So you can see some of them just there. And so we're seeing a real pickup in these applications. And so that's also good to see. It's good for the ecosystem. But I think the core principle here is how well are these apps working? Are they good? And what are some really good, I suppose, like examples or ways to think about it? And I want to show just quickly one example of an app that we built. This is a very early demo that we did with Statista in terms of how we can build their kind of MCP app. And this was something that we did early in staging, but I think it shows value that you can bring to AI. So a lot of people do research in AI in general, but you're just trusting the model to get the data that you want. Instead, using something like Statista, you can get verified data, but you can actually visualize it in ChatGPT. And then on top of that, you can actually get some text below. I don't know if the video maybe continues. We'll see how long it is. Oh. But then you also get the text response below it as well, where it then talks about the data that it's seeing. Maybe we don't get lucky with the rest of the demo. But I think it shows it's not something that you can natively do within ChatGPT. And so it provides a really good UI and interface so you can visualize the data on top of it. And I think from first principles, that's what you want to be thinking about when you're designing these kind of apps. To get into how they work, before we get into the principles very quickly, so there are three components that you need to understand. You've got the ChatGPT interface, right? This is where users are prompting. You've then got the MCP server, which has tools that are exposed. And then those tools will be able to call a widget that then gets pushed back into the conversation. So to show you an example of that, this is booking.com. Let's take this instance. You can say, show me hotels in New York for tomorrow. When that's exposed, it will then pick up the tool that then best serves that need. So it's going to find the accommodation search. It's going to say, well, it said the area New York, the date for tomorrow. And then on the back of that, it's then going to pull that widget through, and then it's going to basically show you those options specific to the area and date that you requested. Now, the thing that's particularly interesting is those tools have descriptions. And they are basically one of the core primitives as to how ChatGPT knows to use which apps and tools. And this is a really important piece to understand because we're starting to see the beginning of a new paradigm where it's working very similar to SEO and AEO. These are search terms that you can optimize for your tool to better help with discovery. And so this is a really core point of actually designing these apps. Very quickly, to understand a little bit more about how this works, because it's really, really core to designing these, you've got these three components, and you need to understand sort of the relationship that they play between each other. So you've got the model at its core. You can think of this like the orchestration layer. It's able to call the public tools, i.e. the tools that the MCPs expose. It's got also, really importantly, this full context and memory. It understands the chat the user's having. It understands memory of the user. It's able to use the public tools to call the MCP server. So this is when you're building your MCP app, you are defining the tools that it has. What is this app going to do? It's able to directly talk to those, right? It also handles all the authentication, security, the business logic, things like this. You then have the widget. The widget can, from the MCP server, bring through these basically private tools that actually show the UI at the front end, right? This is importantly a sandbox iframe. So you can directly control that experience within that iframe, and that is the core primitive of what the widget does, and then you can then insert that back into the model. And importantly, you'll notice that that arrow, that is a one-way arrow. So you are inserting that widget directly into the model, but the model isn't able to necessarily always read what's going on in that widget. So it's very important from also a data perspective. For example, when we're working with a company like Statista, they've got private data. They don't want to, I suppose, expose all of the data that they have into ChatGPT for training. And so having that widget is really important. And that's true for any business. Any enterprise you speak to, they will be conscious of what data they're giving to the model. And so it's important that it isn't always that kind of read relationship. Now, the interesting part, or the more interesting part, I should hope, principles. So these are some of the things that we've come across during our time building and distributing these apps. And the first one is a little bit more technical, but I really wanted to start with it because it's just so true for everyone that we speak to in this space. You have to start with goals and intents. And the really important part here, whenever we speak to companies, is actually kind of just figuring out what are we even trying to achieve in this space, and does it really align to what the MCP app space is today? You know, how many people are going to ChatGPT today rather than Uber to order their taxi? Not sure, but perhaps not that many. No, so what are you actually really getting when you're trying to do that kind of app? Well, you're learning a huge amount. You're early in the ecosystem, but you need to kind of have some expectations around, OK, are you really going to be converting people through this kind of UI? So it's important to kind of just premise that. And then I would say the really important part is this intent-based framing. So whenever you're designing a ChatGPT app, our belief is that everything should be orientated around that. You need to define the intent you're trying to go after, and that then is everything that flows into the tools that you then define in the UI that you then have. And that should be done on a persona basis. So you need to understand the user, think about what are they actually typing into ChatGPT, which is different from web, it's different from mobile, and then backwards engineered tool sets to try and achieve that. I put Fractal in the top corner because for anyone that hasn't built an MCP app before or is maybe looking to just get started and prototype some stuff, it's a really, really good no-code developer. And they basically do a really good job at the beginning of basically taking your request, turning it into intents, and then building the tools around it. Now, this is around tooling. And basically, you can think of the tooling set or the tool description really as a system prompt. And we've been tracking, like I said, the ChatGPT App Store since it went live. Every app that's in there, we've taken 316 of the apps that were present when I took the data, and basically analyzed across each of these tools, every single tool in there, I think there's like 2,100 or so, what patterns are they using for the descriptions? And so this is basically a really good way to understand how are people using the description of the tool as a system prompt to navigate what the app does and what the model does. And we can see that over 57% of these apps are using something called negative constraints. I've got some examples on the next slide I'll run through. And there's a couple of interesting ones here, particularly things like error recovery. So if you actually do get an error, you want to make sure that you have a good experience for the user to make sure that they get some sort of understanding of why there's been an error so they can improve the experience after it. Also things like multi-turn context, which we'll talk to, but it's very interesting to see across these apps what are the most common patterns for actually controlling and using your tools as system prompts. Here are two examples of that. So you've got Uber, which uses negative constraints basically to just make sure that it doesn't ever hallucinate a location. So imagine that someone comes in and it hallucinates where to pick up from or hallucinates where to drop off at. Not good. So it basically ensures that it's just training the model to never do that. We have had an instance with Statista where you don't want it where data comes in, and the whole point is that it's verified statistics, but then the model then goes and says, oh, I'm going to add some other research to these insights. So it's about creating what's called these guardrails, right? How can you just make sure that you're only ever using the values that have been given from the data rather than anything that's outside of that? Another thing is about letting the model do the work. So this is a principle, I suppose, just to have in mind, in that these AI models are obviously incredibly intelligent and can do a huge amount. And you don't need to do this necessarily for every single tool. So an interesting stat is that the majority of apps actually in the App Store are just single tool apps. And I think that's good. They're very simple. They're light to use. But something else that's interesting is if you do have a more complex use case where it's difficult to understand what data you might want to bring back, you can do something around multi-tool use where it brings in the model and lets the model do the work instead. So this is, again, an example from the Statista MCP where you have search statistics. And when you have search statistics is called, it's going to bring up from everything that Statista has a huge amount of different potential statistics it could use. Now, what you could have is a scoring system that then determines, OK, we think this is the best match. And then it's going to actually just return that statistic directly. Now, alternatively, now that you've got the model in there, when you create a tool-tool approach, you can give all of the potential statistics to the model, and then have the model decide, based on its understanding of the intent and potential context memory, what is the most relevant statistic to then bring back to the user. So at that point, it then picks the chart from the second tool, and then that's what's actually presented. So it's a different way to structure the tools, so you're actually really leveraging the power of the model. And here's another example of that, talking about how, because this model, it's not just obviously intelligent, it also has this context and memory. So you can see here, this is another sort of data tool, render tool. In the model, it's obviously got this context and memory. So if you have a prompt that said, let's say, like booking.com, show me a hotel option in New York, let's say you returned 50 different hotel listings. Well, that's fantastic, but what you'd ideally want is to show them the exact right hotel based on their preferences. So if you understand through context and memory some personalized options that would be the best ones that suited, you could either just show those three or at least show those three first. So it's a way to work with these tools to better leverage the model to get good outcomes. Another one is around designing for both surfaces. So obviously, when you're just working with web or mobile, you have your UI interface. And that's the predominant interface where they're experiencing your application. Whereas now, you've actually got two components. You've got both the UI widget, and then you've got the text that's below it to append what you're seeing in the widget. And these things actually are both really important. Users look at both of them. And so you want to make sure that they're working in harmony, they're actually acting together. And so the widget, this is more something that you have a lot of control over, right? But the model response, you can influence it, but it's obviously the model's interpretation of what's happening. But I think this is to say you need to think about both, and you can influence the model's response. And so one way to do that you can see from Zillow here. They use a couple of different interesting ones, I think particularly at the bottom where it talks about, it mentions, do not speculate on, or comment on how fair a valuation, price might be. So you can imagine a model coming back and seeing an option and then saying, oh, this doesn't feel like a particularly good deal. Something like that would be not good. So you want to make sure that you're controlling the response that's actually coming back after an answer, rather than just allowing it to kind of have a bit more or free will. Another one is around, and I've got two more after this, design for conversation rather than one-off prompt. So we see this a lot, and it's sort of a general principle that I would say across the piece, which is try as best as possible to get into the framing of how are people actually using AI in these chatbots, and how do you? So a lot of the time when you're actually working with these tools, you're not just doing a one prompt to try and get something. What you're actually doing is a multi-turn experience where you can't really read it. It's quite small, but it will say something like, show me hotels in Rome for next week. And then it will say, actually make it cheaper. And then you'll say, well, what about actually the week after, right? This is a more familiar kind of experience that I'm sure you guys have because you are filtering your own options. So you want to design for that in mind. How do you design to make sure that you are appealing for that? And from our data, we found that only 7% of apps are proactively designing for this. And so I definitely recommend when you're looking at your tool descriptions to build this kind of thing in. A good example of it is actually the first thing that Expedia mentions in their tool. Interestingly, they have, you can see how long these tool descriptions can get, by the way, really, really detailed in terms of controlling the experience. They mention that you always, particularly the bit where it goes, search intent, initial, or follow-up, do not answer from general knowledge, but call the tool again using the updated parameters. So it's always mentioning, OK, when someone gives an updated requirement, you don't want it to go back to the original request. You want to make sure it's updating the parameters, going for another search, and then returning those most relevant pieces. So I definitely recommend getting that kind of thing in. I think the two last ones are very interesting. A lot, what you guys will know when you're developing ChatGPT apps and MCP apps, a lot of the testing that happens is actually in evals. So you're testing in a simulated environment. And what we've seen is actually there is up to a 60% difference between the testing that you get in staging and actually live behavior in ChatGPT. So one thing that happens is that a lot of the time when you're doing this testing, you're doing it with a model, for example, like ChatGPT 4.5, and actually you're doing it maybe with a paid account. The reality of when you're actually using ChatGPT apps or all the other users that are out there, they are likely on free accounts. They maybe have already been chatting loads of stuff within a conversation, and then they want to bring in an app. What ChatGPT actually does is over time during a conversation, it will degrade the model that the user is using. Maybe if they've used ChatGPT a lot today, or it's a really long context window. The second that they do that, you have a completely different experience in terms of how your app gets called. And so it's just a huge difference in terms of percentage of success. And so what you see is that we've seen a 7 times higher failure rate when you're testing also with structured prompts compared to sort of realistic prompts. So this is also where, kind of like similar to staging versus live, we see it where if you're testing with these really, really rigid prompt types that are kind of more eval testing type, rather than these casual real-world prompts like I showed on the last page where you say, oh, just show me something cheaper or anything like that rather than structured, again, it's 7 times higher failure rate. So you want to make sure when you're testing, it's as real as possible. So test at scale. Test as many prompts as possible. You want to do it for realistic prompts that actually align to your user persona. And really importantly, you want to do it live in the client. You want to make sure you're actually testing directly in ChatGPT at scale to get the best results. And then the final one is around building for distribution. So the whole point, I think, for most people is when you're building these apps, you want users to use them. And there are 2 different ways that you can get discovered today. So you've got your static discovery. This is where you are in the ChatGPT App Store. So users, at the moment today, it's the only way that they can find you. They have to go to the App Store. They have to connect your app. And then they will be able to directly use it. They've recently added it where you don't actually necessarily have to mention the app, but you can use it, and it will just turn up in a flow if you do a prompt that's relevant. It's actually something that Anthropic have had for a long time, and they're particularly good at tool use in this instance. So you need to think about the App Store. You need to make sure you're optimizing for it. Things like your description. You can see in our tracker, there's some apps that appear for way more keywords than others because they've done a better job at optimizing. So you want to make sure you're doing that. The second thing is organic, and this is where I think this whole space, to be honest, becomes a lot more interesting, which is how can I start to optimize my tools to make sure that I'm appearing for prompts, both organically, when an app actually appears at the bottom of a prompt, that's something that we expect to be coming down the line. But then in addition, when a user isn't tagging my app, am I appearing when someone says, book me a hotel, or is my competitor? So the best ways to do that is to really think about your tool description as the new SEO. It is something you need to optimize. It's something that you need to refine to make sure that you're constantly appearing, you're testing, you're appearing for the prompts that you want to be. Like I've said, we've seen that 1 in 7 times when an app, so we did this test of 83 apps, we found 14% average failure rate for invocation. So what that means is that 1 in 7 times when an app is called, it actually just fails. So there's a huge amount of times where apps are just not getting called at all, and that obviously leads to a really poor experience, and so that's bad for distribution. So you want to be finding ways to make sure that you can get as good optimization as possible to your app. Every time you have a potential to be called, it does get called. And then the final one is to just, I guess maybe a tip. We're still so early in this ecosystem, so we're still trying to figure out the best ways to structure these apps. Actually, apps that have fewer tools and better tools generally have a higher rate of actually having more invocations because it's just less complexity for the model to reason with, and you have just less opportunity to not have something optimized and then fail. So the simpler you can make these apps to serve a refined intent, I think the better at this stage. So little takeaways. I definitely recommend really understanding that triangle of the model, the MCP server, the widget, and the relationships between them, so that you can just best understand what levers to pull if you want to refine something. Absolutely start with intent. It's probably the thing that we see, particularly work with enterprises the most, is getting that new framing of everything is downstream of what is the intention you're trying to get from a particular user. Tool description is everything. It is the new SEO. It's something that you really need to think about, and it even just refines the whole way that your app is used directly. And then finally, test live. Make sure that you're testing directly in the client, because it's a huge difference to testing just evals. We'd love to connect. If you want to chat about anything in the space, definitely reach out. We're here for the rest of today. If you want to check out appdiscoverability.com as well, we focus on helping you monitor apps live in ChatGPT, running conversational testing, optimization agents, things like this. And yeah, definitely attend as well. There's a talk at 5:30 by my business partner on the discoverability topic, so if you want to check that out, you can. And yeah, I think that's all I've got for questions. Thank you.